Hello, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to do this drawing of a lighthouse. It's essentially a seascape in charcoal. Let's have a look. So the first thing I'm going to do is a simple sketch. The drawing is going to be divided roughly into two parts, with the lighthouse more or less in the center, a little bit more to the right. Now the reference will be included if you want to check it out, but I will make some changes to it as usual because there were some things that I didn't really like, so I wanted to make some adjustments. Now as for the materials, I'm going to use Master woodless charcoal pencils and some willow charcoal. For erasing, I'm going to use a kneaded eraser and Tombow Mono Zero eraser, and I'm going to use some brushes and tortillons for blending. So I'm doing the sketch mostly with Kohinoor graphite pencil. First I'm going to draw this line of the water here, and for that I'm going to use a ruler. I don't often use a ruler, but I want the water to be both straight and level. Now as for the upper portion, which is going to be considerably lighter, I'm just going to use a little bit of charcoal powder. I'm going to try pushing that around with a brush first to distribute it more or less evenly, and after that I'm going to blend with a piece of paper towel. So what I'm trying to do is create an area of lighter value that's more or less smooth with no texture, no detail, but just a little bit of value so that I could create contrast with the lighthouse, which is white. It's supposed to be lighter than the background. But as you can see, I didn't really add that much value to the background, so I'm probably going to need to add a little bit more. So now I started working with a charcoal pencil and I'm adding some details to the top of the lighthouse. And I can sharpen these woodless charcoal pencils pretty well, so I can draw some of these tiny details in charcoal. It's a little bit easier than using charcoal sticks. Now here I decided to start shading the background with willow charcoal because the background was just too light and there wasn't enough contrast with the lighthouse. Now don't worry, it's not going to remain this dark once I start blending, because that material is going to be distributed evenly once I start blending it and pushing it around with a paper towel. So you can see as I'm blending, it's getting pretty even and it's getting a lot lighter, and the lines are disappearing. But it's better to do this with charcoal powder or graphite powder if you can. This was a little bit faster. It was a little bit faster and a little bit messier maybe, and it can leave a bit of texture. But I'm going to show you a little trick with which you can get rid of those lines if you want to make sure that you have a nice gradient so that you can blend it more smoothly. You can actually use a bit of chalk. I can use this white chalk pastel, or you can use any piece of chalk, white chalk, and you can go over that and then just blend that with the charcoal, and that'll make it a little bit more even. That'll make the blending a little bit more even, so that you can get rid of those tiny lines or textures if you want. I mean, it looked okay even without it, but this will make it extra smooth because it's the sky, it's the background. I don't want any detail or any suggestion of detail in there. So the next thing is to clean up the light side and the edge of that lighthouse. It's looking a little bit crooked, but I'm going to fix it anyway. It's going to look better eventually. So the important thing is to create contrast between the light side of the lighthouse, which is on the left, so you can tell that the light source is coming from the left and the shadow side of the lighthouse is to the right. And now I'm back to working with charcoal pencil and just adding some small details here at the top on the roof and on these railings, whatever they are. I can't really make out all of the details, and I don't really have to. Just going to simplify and approximate. There's like a small window here in the middle. So I did most of the blending with brushes or that piece of paper towel, and I can also blend some of the smaller details with tortillons. I'm going to add a couple of smaller houses here at the bottom of the lighthouse. I'm just going to add some more details to those as well, and of course shade them, because their light side is going to be on the left, and the side of the house which is facing away from the light source is obviously going to be darker. Now this lighthouse is mostly on a bare rock, on a bare rocky piece of land, but didn't really like it, so I decided to add a few trees here because I like trees, and I'm just gonna, I think they're gonna make the scene a bit more interesting. So I'm just gonna throw in some canopies of some trees around these houses. I used a combination of willow charcoal and charcoal pencil, using the charcoal pencil for those darker areas and to create some texture, some random texture. And then I refined that using a tortillon. So that's pretty much the upper portion of the scene. Now comes the more interesting part of the scene, and it's going to be all these rocks and the sea. That's why I said it's essentially a seascape, because that's what it is. We're drawing a rocky shore, except for the fact that here the central detail is this lighthouse, which is probably going to attract the focus of the viewer because of its position and because of the contrast. Nonetheless, I need to put a lot of work into these rocks. So as you can see, I'm using a charcoal pencil to draw these small darker shapes, and I'm trying to vary their size, shape, angle a little bit so that they look like actual rocks. And this is not entirely random, by the way. While I'm doing this, I'm always keeping in mind where the light source is, and the light source is coming from above and from the left, which means that I'm drawing all of these smaller shapes and smaller surfaces, keeping that in mind. Because as long as you keep that in mind, as long as you're aware of the direction of the light source and the direction of the shadows, in the direction in which the shadows are being cast, you will be able to come up with shapes that look realistic, convincing to the viewer. So you can see that this portion of that rocky shore, which is facing towards us, which is facing away from the light source, which is coming from above, is darker. And for the sky, for the sea, for the ocean, whatever it is, I'm going to use the willow charcoal, because that's going to be easier to blend and easier to erase. So here I'm going to use a bit more material and a bit more pressure, because I want this to be darker than the sky. And I'm just going to use a flat brush to blend the edge, because I want to keep it straight and level. And I'm going to blend around these rocks, and I'm also going to blend the rocks as well. But the point is that I want to make the water look a bit darker, and of course considerably darker than the sky. And later I'm going to add some details to that. I'm going to add some suggestions of waves and some splashing water crashing against the rocks, but I'll get to that in a minute. Now, as I'm blending with a brush, that by itself will produce some suggestions of waves. So you don't really need to try too hard to work on every single detail. Sometimes some details or suggestions of details will just appear by themselves. Anyway, as you can see, I'm drawing some of these smaller waves and some splashing water around the rocks, because the waves are going to be crashing against the shore. And I'm also cleaning up the edge of the top side of these rocks so that it stands out against the water, because it's going to be catching light from above, obviously, so it needs to be a bit lighter. You always have to keep in mind the direction of the light source, or where it is, the position of the light source rather. I added a bit more value overall because these rocks and that whole piece of land needs to be a little bit darker, but I'm going to add some lighter details to it as well. Here and there I can add some random smaller rocks which are kind of jutting out of the water, because I want a lot of these smaller irregular shapes. And I'm going to also try to add a little bit of detail and a bit of texture to the to the land as well. I can do that by using a combination of both the pencil and the eraser, because the Tombow Mono Zero eraser is very convenient because you can hold it and use it like a pencil. So I use the charcoal pencil to draw these darker details, and I simply use the Tombow Mono Zero eraser to draw lighter details. It's like drawing, but instead of drawing darker shapes and darker lines, you're drawing lighter lines. And of course, every now and then I will use brushes and some of the blending tools where I feel like the texture is a little bit too much. So now I'm pulling some lighter details using the Tombow Mono Zero eraser. If you can't find this one, you can also use the kneaded eraser. The kneaded eraser will work just as well. It's just that this one is a bit more convenient. Also, there is the Kohinoor pencil eraser that works really well too. Now that I'm mostly happy with the appearance of the rocks, and they kind of look a bit more three-dimensional because of the range of value and because of the contrast between the lighter and darker shapes, or lighter and darker sides of those rocky shapes. Now I'm shading the rest of the water here in the bottom portion of the drawing, and I just did that with a piece of willow charcoal and blended it with a brush. It's quick and easy. The thing I like about willow charcoal and vine charcoal, which is soft natural charcoal, is that it's so easy to manipulate. It's easy to move around. So it's kind of like painting. It's kind of like watercolor. You can just move it around, add a bit more where needed, or take away just by using a clean brush. So it's very easy to control the amount of value and maybe to create some suggestions of shapes in a very spontaneous and relaxing manner. I added a few more trees on top of those rocks just to make that empty area a little bit more interesting. I don't know, like this small wooded area on top of those rocks. It's not really the way it's in my reference, but I just use the reference as an inspiration, and I like to improvise a little bit and construct a scene that's more to my liking. Also, my initial idea was to draw only a few rocks in the lower right corner, but I'm probably going to add more. Now, I'm adding some more of these splashing foamy details here at the bottom of, or under these rocks rather. in the middle and on the right as well, and I'm adding some tiny suggestions of ripples and splashes in the water, because when these waves are moving and when they're kind of crashing against one another and against the shore, the crest of those waves is going to appear foamy sometimes as the water crashes and splashes. So just by adding a few of those lighter details with an eraser, you can make a very realistic looking ocean. Anyway, now I'm going to draw some more rocks here to make this bottom part of the scene a bit more interesting. So like I said, my initial plan was to only have one group of rocks rather than two groups of rocks in the foreground like in my reference, but I decided to make it more like the reference because I wanted some rocks in the foreground on the left, in the bottom left portion of the paper as well. But I changed the size, the shape and the positioning a little bit, as you will see. So first I add some of these darker shapes, darker lines, to indicate where the shadow areas and the cracks are, and then I work on top of that with an eraser to define some of the lighter details and lighter surfaces, and to make the overall texture of the rocks a bit more interesting. And by the way, in case you're wondering about the pencils I'm using, the Master's Touch woodless charcoal pencils, they come in 3 grades: hard, medium and soft. In this video I only used the medium because I find that it's a good all-round charcoal pencil, and in many of my drawings I either use only the medium or medium and a little bit of soft charcoal pencil. So I added some more of that foamy water around those rocks at the bottom as well. And now I think the scene is starting to look a lot more complete. And like I said, I'm going to add another group of rocks here at the bottom. But the problem here is that my camera wasn't really adjusted properly. So I wasn't recording the bottom portion of the paper, so I'm afraid I lost that part of the footage where I drew these rocks at the bottom, but I'm kind of refining them now and making their edges a bit more jagged, a bit more rough and a bit more natural looking. I also put my signature in the lower right corner. And I'm just putting down some finishing touches on the rocks because the scene is mostly done. I kind of like the composition now. I'm not going to add anything else to it. I just need to remove this tape now. And the best way to remove it is to be very careful. I'm just going to remove some tiny details here. I'll blend them in with a brush rather. And like I said, the best way to do this is to be very careful and to pull away from the edge of the paper, and that way you won't cause any damage to the paper. Anyway, the drawing is finished. Just a few tiny details with an eraser, and the drawing is done. I want to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already. Give me a like and comment, let me know what you think, and check out my other videos. And for longer videos, more content, full-length narrated videos, check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.